Ancient History 206, Lesson 19, Egypt, the Second Intermediate Period. Uh, I do apologize for having to cancel class a week ago. And of course, we had no class yesterday because it was Veterans Day. So we are actually 8 days removed from lesson 18, and we're officially behind because we're on lesson 19 and we should be further along than that in our series. The second intermediate period of Egypt is of special interest, I believe, to Bible students because it is one of the possible intersection points between Egyptian history and biblical history. What is often referred to as the invasion of the Hyksos, an Asiatic, thought to be Canaanite dynasty in Egypt, was during this period, as we'll see in a few moments. It is possible, though certainly not certain. I think it is likely, but it's possible, we'll say, that Joseph was in Egypt either when the Hyksos arrived or that Joseph came into Egypt during the Hyksos dynasty, which would explain how he rose to prominence if he was from the Levant region, the region that we call the Holy Land, and they were from the Levant region. They would have spoken each other's language, shared several customs in common, and there would have been some kinship as they were essentially they were expats, expatriates. They were foreigners in the land of Egypt. So it's a possible intersection point. I think we have to be careful about being overly dogmatic with opinions about those types of things when we're looking at ancient history and biblical history. Um, okay, so the second intermediate period was a period of disarray. It is best known as when the Hyksos, you will hear it pronounced multiple ways. Hyksos seems to be the most common, which doesn't necessarily mean it is correct. Ask an ancient Egyptian next time you see one from the 18th to the 17th century what the correct pronunciation of Hyksos is, and they can tell you. The second intermediate period was a period of disarray. It is best known as when the Hyksos, whose reign comprised the 15th and 16th dynasties, made their appearance in Egypt. Around the time Memphis fell to the Hyksos, the native Egyptian ruling house in Thebes declared its independence and set itself up as the 17th dynasty. This dynasty eventually drove the Hyksos back into Asia. Okay, so you will find that there is a lot of dispute, disagreement, and there are lots of questions about who and what was where during this period. Our original source is, as usual, Manetho. Manetho is obviously a source that there is some question about. For one thing, Manetho was during the Ptolemaic period, 3rd century BC. So, we're approximately 1500 years later than this period. Manetho clearly had an anti foreigner bias in his writings. And since the Hyksos in particular were foreigners, there is a bit of bias that you can almost hear the bias dripping as you listen to the words of Manetho. It's also important to remember that um, his his bias was also going to be influenced by the kings that conquered the Hyksos, intentionally trying as much as possible to tell the story of the Hyksos from their point of view as native Egyptian rulers. So I think it's really important that we're careful about how we allow these to be portrayed in our minds, because there's a lot of things we don't know, and a lot of what we think we know could even be somewhat suspect. So we have to be careful about that. Um, and um, I think we can, uh, I'm sorry, I think we can, if we're careful and cautious, we can come to certain conclusions with uh, a little bit more security that what we say is going to be more accurate. Um, I apologize. Give me just a second. I've got a slight technical issue here. Uh, okay, and I am returning now my full attention to you guys. Apologize for that. Okay, so the around the time Memphis fell to the Hyksos, the native Egyptian ruling house in Thebes declared its independence and set itself up as the 17th dynasty. This dynasty eventually drove the Hyksos back into Asia. Today, we're going to focus our attention on the 14th, the 15th, and the 16th dynasties, and likely save Dynasty 17 for next Monday as we get into the beginning of the Middle Kingdom. I'm sorry, the New Kingdom. Um, so here is Lower Egypt, and here is Upper Egypt. Oh, actually, let me get my mouse to where you can see it. Lower Egypt, Upper Egypt. I want to point out three specific sections of Egypt to you so that the things we're going to talk about will make sense with these three dynasties. First of all, the Nile Delta region here, Lower Egypt, which includes everything, including the Nile Delta, down to this shoehorn shape in the Nile River. Okay. And then Upper Egypt is everything that is kind of below the horseshoe. And notice also Thebes in Upper Egypt. It's going to be a capital we will look at. Okay. Um, so as we are looking at these different dynasties, be aware of these sections of the kingdoms. Okay. Oops. Yeah. So it's two things. It's it's because of the what's upriver and what's downriver, yes, but it also has to do with elevation. Obviously, Alexandria in the north on this map, Lower Egypt, where the delta is, this is going to be sea level, and this is going to be a hilly area. So Upper Egypt is higher elevation than Lower Egypt, and Upper Egypt is upriver. So from our perspective, it's backward, right? We would think Lower Egypt should be south, Upper Egypt should be north, but it is counterintuitive for us Westerners. Okay, so the 14th dynasty lasted about 75 years, and it seems to have been limited in scope to the Nile Delta region, which is this area right here. And its capital um, was Zeus, which does not appear on the map, but suffice it to say, it's a little bit further to the west than Avaris. And then you'll notice Memphis here, Avaris here. What's interesting is that the Hyksos apparently ruled from Avaris, even though that is technically part of the Nile Delta. So when we're talking about the 14th dynasty, be aware of that, that this section right here of Avaris, this area is actually controlled by the Hyksos. Okay. It runs concurrently with the 13th and 15th dynasties. So the 14th dynasty in the Nile appears to have broken away from Egypt during the reign of the last pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom and the 13th dynasty. And they were co-regent or co-regent with the Hyksos dynasty in Lower Egypt. We've seen Egypt divided before, but now we see it divided into three parts for approximately 75 years, though according to Manethos, he would have said it was about 155 years. But Manethos seems to be wrong a lot. He has a very extended view of Egyptian history, even more extended than modern historians do. Um, Egypt was not a united kingdom during this time. This is sometimes referred to as the Dark Ages of Egypt. Okay. It's interesting. People say there's no evidence for Joseph in Egypt, which I don't think is true. People say, there's no evidence for the Israelites in Egypt, which I also don't think is true. But at the same time, one of the time periods in which I think Joseph might have been in Egypt is during the reign of the Hyksos in the 15th dynasty, which was the same time as this 14th dynasty. And what I find strange is the idea that during this dark ages, when so little is known, and much of what we know we have had to piece together from various sources and try to verify and revise with archaeology, there's so much that we don't know about this period that it's interesting to me that a historian would say definitively that Joseph couldn't have been here, in spite of the fact that we know so little. In the same time period as the 14th dynasty, we see the rise of the Hyksos with the 15th dynasty, and its early years overlap the 14th dynasty, ruling roughly the rest of Lower Egypt and the Sinai Peninsula, and part of southern Canaan. You can see the Hyksos kingdom on this map goes all the way up into southern Canaan and includes the Sinai Peninsula. Capital is Avaros, and they rule all of this section. And the Abydos dynasty appears to have broken off and ruled separately here in this tiny little portion on the edge of the river, just north west of where Dynasty 16 is also ruling at the same time. So there were up to 4 dynasties ruling in Egypt at the same time during this second intermediate period. Okay. Um, the uh, the 15th dynasty's early years overlap the 14th dynasty's ruling roughly the rest of Lower Egypt and the Sinai Peninsula and part of southern Canaan. These kings based at Avaris were um, were of Canaanite origin. They appear to have migrated from the Holy Land during the Middle Kingdom, and contrary to Manetho's claims, they rose to power in the vacuum created by the collapse of the Middle Kingdom's final rulers. So here's what's happened in the last 150 years with regard to the the second intermediate period. Manetho had recorded that the Hyksos were an invading force from the land of Canaan, from Asia, that came in as conquerors and destroyed Middle Kingdom Egypt and set up shop in its place. And they ran roughshod over the pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom. Um, that doesn't seem to be what we find archaeologically. There's no real evidence of a wholesale invasion. It seems rather that the Hyksos actually had come into Egypt from the Sinai Peninsula during the end of the Middle Kingdom and had come in as traders. Um, they had come in looking for places to do pasturing because they were shepherds. And over time, they set up and they began to rise in the ranks of nobility and may have taken over as nomarchs some of the nomes of Egypt, of Upper Egypt. I'm sorry, of Lower Egypt. And as a result, when everything fell apart at the end of the Middle Kingdom and the different nomarchs began fighting for more and more local control and fighting with each other, the Hyksos actually simply were dominant. And the reason they were dominant was because they had better technology. They had horse drawn chariots, they had created the composite bow. And a composite bow is obviously a bow that is made of more than just wood and string, and it gave them a more accurate shooting bow and also one with a longer range. As a result of those two innovations, along with their ability to smelt um, copper uh, and tin into very strong bronze, they were excellent metallurgists. They were able to make better swords and weapons and shields and tools. So, as a result of their technological prowess, they seem to have simply taken over in the chaos, but they may have already been there. Okay. Um, the 16th dynasty is interesting because the 16th dynasty is also the Hyksos. It was a dynasty of pharaohs that ruled in the Theban region. So you're further down here. Okay. Um, this dynasty is it's interesting that it's separate from the dynasty 15, kind of a continuation. Um, when they took over Thebes. Okay. Um, interestingly enough, Manetho's Egyptica describes the 16th dynasty differently than the Africanus account. Um, Cincillus calls them shepherd kings after the work of Africanus. Um, Eusebius refers to them as Thebans. Um, in 1997, historians began to reconstruct the Turin canon and say, you know, this doesn't appear that this canon that we found in Turin doesn't appear to be all that accurate. So let's begin to revise it based on the archaeology that we have found. One of the conclusions that was found was that it appears there was really no invasion, as we talked about a few moments ago. So the armies of the 15th dynasty would continue winning town after town, going further and further south with their mighty chariots until eventually, over the course of time, they would come and conquer Thebes and take over this area of Upper Egypt as well. Okay. It's also possible that peace broke out because there was a peace decree or a peace treaty made between the native Theban kings and the Hyksos as they came in. Um, it appears that the 16th dynasty were either Hyksos or they were vassals of the Hyksos. In other words, they may have been native Egyptians, but if they were native Egyptians, they were simply under the rulership of the Hyksos in the north. Um, why there are two different dynasties if they're Hyksos? That's a good question, except that there appear to be two different family lines. Other than that, you would say that's really one kingdom. Um, the names of the kings of these dynasties are also really interesting. Okay. Um, the if the uh, if we take the idea that the 16th dynasty was an independent Theban dynasty, which some have suggested, then we're going to have trouble explaining what the relationship was between the Thebans and the Hyksos because there is evidence of Hyksos dominance during the region. In any case, we know that the 14th, the 15th, and the 16th dynasties were all around about the same time, and the Abydos dynasty popped up for a short time during that time. Okay, so when we look then at the uh, 14th, 15th, and 16th dynasties, that's the backdrop against which we're going to view them. So let's take a moment and overview the kings of the 14th dynasty. Um, there enough, there's enough that we don't know about this Nile Delta kingdom that it's really hard to pin down the chronology very well. You can get a lot of argument among a lot of historians, but it does seem that it was about 75 years. You'll notice in your textbook as you were reading about this over the last week that that's what Bauer says, about 75 years. I tend to agree with that. Others suggest it may have been, as Manetho thought, over 100 years, maybe even 150 to 155. But I honestly think that the 14th dynasty emerged during the late 12th dynasty and that it probably emerged somewhere around 1800 BC. And during that time, um, Sobek-Neferu was in the waning period of the rule of that pharaoh. It's also, I think, important to understand that holding the Nile Delta region against the might of the Hyksos means that this was a very well organized, very powerful group of kings. Otherwise, they would have been overwhelmed within weeks, not decades. Certainly not over the course of a couple of generations. Okay. Um, The local Canaanite population in the eastern Delta region probably is where the Hyksos came from. In Avaris, they declared their independence and they began conquering slowly and slowly and slowly more and more of Lower Egypt. During all this time, though, the 14th dynasty managed to maintain itself in the Nile Delta. Okay. Um, the 14th dynasty is said to have had up to 76 kings, but they ever only had one capital, Zeus. It wasn't Avaris, it was Zeus. Some also suggest, though, that there might have been only as many as 56 kings. Um, but there are differences in the records between the Turin Canon and the records of Manetho and the other fragments that we have found. Okay. Um, the the Egyptian artwork and statuary also indicates that some of the ancient sources lean toward Avaris as being the capital instead of Zeus. So that's what I mean when I say most of what we think we know, there are reasons to question. But the best evidence seems to indicate that Zeus was the capital, and there were somewhere between 50 and 70 kings in what was most likely only about a 75-year period. Okay. Um, it is also interesting that we have found archaeological evidence of this group of kings, of this dynasty and its existence outside of the Nile Delta, even all the way in northern Israel, or what is today northern Israel. We have found in the region of what we would today think of as the Gaza Strip area. We have found evidence of coins and other things that would have come from Egypt during this period. It's really hard to get a really accurate idea of who ruled for how long and when. But we do have some information from the Turin Royal Canon, and most of what it says about the first few of the rulers are pretty widely accepted. The first one was Yakbim Sekaenre, and it is possible that he might not have existed at all, or that he was actually a vassal of the Hyksos. It's possible that he belongs somewhere else in the chronology altogether. The sources are not always accurate. But for the most part, Yakdim Sakai Amri is considered to be the first king of the 14th dynasty. The second, Yaamu Nubwaseri, is also contested, but he is thought to have come second. Okay. Um, Kara Kawasara is thought to have been third, and Amu Ahotepre is fourth, followed by Sheshi Ma'ab Ibra, and he is the most well recorded of the pharaohs of this dynasty. Um, Hundreds of scarab seals. He may have even been known to have been married to a Kushite princess whose name was Tati. And even though the chronological position of this king is attested, his existence, or excuse me, is contested, his existence is pretty well attested by all of the evidence we have found of him. Okay. But he may have actually been a vassal ruling the Nile Delta under the auspices of the Hyksos in the east and south. Um, there are some less controversial rulers that are established by the Turin Canon who came later, but we're not entirely sure we can be as dogmatic about their dates as we would like. For example, according to the Turin Canon, in the same year, Nehesi Senhri and Kakawari both ruled, and they both ruled obviously for less than a year. Immediately followed by Nebefari, who ruled for 1 year, 5 months, and 15 days. Sehebri then reigned for 3 years, and Merjafari reigned after Sehebri, but we don't know for how long. And down goes the list, over 75 kings, most of them ruled for only a matter of days, weeks, or months. Few lasted more than 1 to 2 years. And there are even pharaohs whose names are included in the list of possible rulers of the 14th dynasty that may actually belong in the 15th, the 16th, or the 13th. And some are thought to have actually been 12th dynasty kings who just happen to have been misrecorded somewhere. It's a very confusing time to live in the Nile Delta. And it never got less confusing for those of us reading about it after the fact. So let's move on to the Hyksos. I think that the Hyksos are an extremely interesting group of kings because the timing just seems so interesting. If you look at our illustrious textbook author, Susan Bauer, and we're going to go there. I'm opening the digital version of this textbook, which you're all very familiar with by now. The History of the Ancient World by Susan Wise Bauer. Um, I've heard it said that she was a wise Bauer. Uh, Susan takes us on this journey with the Hyksos beginning in 1782 BC until 1630 BC. And notice it says Western Semites capture the throne of Egypt and the Middle Kingdom ends. So she is identifying the Hyksos not as Hamites, but as Semites, which raises a question for me. If these are not the children of Canaan, are they actually even Canaanites? Um, could they be Semites like the Israelites who have traveled to the region looking for better economic opportunity than they were getting in Mesopotamia or even up north in modern day Syria? I don't know the answer to that for sure, but if in fact the Hyksos were Semitic, which a lot of historians seem to agree they were, that might also make them even more amenable to working with Joseph. Um, if you look at, let's go to the middle of the second column on this page. Manetho begins a new dynasty after Queen Sobek-Nefru, since there was no male heir waiting in the wings. The king who does eventually ascend to the throne to begin the 13th dynasty is a non-entity, a shadowy figure followed by a handful of even more obscure personalities. Okay, so she goes on and on and on, and then she comes to some 30 or 40 years later, yet another dynasty appeared alongside the waning 13th and 14th dynasties. The 15th dynasty had its headquarters at the city of Avaris, which lay in the desert just east of the Delta. The first 15th dynasty king, a man named Sheshi, organized his followers um, into an army and began to spread his rule to the west and the south by force. Some 20 years later, she dates that around 1663. I actually think her date is early. The 15th dynasty had managed to destroy both the 13th and 14th and ruled supreme. According to Manetho, Sheshi was a foreigner. He and his followers belonged to a race called the Desert Princes, or Hika Kaswet, the Hyksos. Manethos described the Hyksos takeover as a violent and sudden overwhelming of Egyptians by savage invasion. For what cause I know not, he writes. A blast of the gods smote us, and unexpectedly from the regions of the east, invaders of obscure race marched in confidence of victory against our land. By main force, they easily overpowered the rulers of the land. They then burned our cities ruthlessly, razed to the ground the temples of gods, and treated all the natives with a cruel hostility, massacring some and leading into slavery the wives and children of others, and appointing as king one of their number. Manetho, an Egyptian, can perhaps be excused for believing that his great ancestors could only have been overcome by a sudden and vigorous attack, but the traces left behind by these 15th dynasty rulers suggest that most of the Hyksos had actually been in Egypt for quite a while. Semitic names begin to appear in the Middle Kingdom inscriptions and lists well before the 1663 takeover. So many Western Semites settled at the town of Avaris. The names mean something like desert mansion, that over time it became almost entirely Semitic. When the 13th and 14th dynasties divided the already weakened leadership of Egypt between them, the inhabitants of Avaris took the opportunity to claim their own piece of the pie. The invasion of Egypt by foreigners was real, but it was primarily an invasion from within. So, my theory is that around the time that the 13th dynasty was collapsing, Joseph was sold by his brothers into slavery and was brought to dwell in the house of the captain of the guard. Whether it was the final emperors of the 13th dynasty, or whether it was a 14th dynasty Nile Delta ruler whose house he originally came to in Avaris, or it was the Hyksos had already taken control. I couldn't say for certain. But I think it likely that 13 years after Joseph came to Egypt, when he stood before Pharaoh, he was standing in front of a Hyksos Pharaoh. And it was the Hyksos who gave Joseph rulership over the land. And the chaos that was ensuing during the time period may also have had something to do with the famine that had engulfed the land. Um, I can't say for certain what the exact series of events was with regard to the 13th, 14th, and 15th dynasties, but it seems likely to me that the Hyksos are a great candidate for the pharaohs of Joseph. It's also interesting that Joseph lived another 90 years after he first came into the court of Pharaoh. And that time period means that he could have been a leading force throughout much of the time of the Hyksos rulers. And he would have been there through the Hyksos reign uh, in Lower Egypt and also when they conquered Upper Egypt. Um, and when it says that another Pharaoh rose up who knew not Joseph in uh, in Genesis, think about what's going to happen when these foreign rulers are finally driven out by the 17th dynasty. They're going to come upon the Hyksos and they're going to be angry and furious about what has happened. And anyone who is associated with the Hyksos is going to fall under their wrath. So the Israelites make a very tempting target, even if they were not technically Hyksos, but were simply associated with them because of Joseph. Any thoughts on the Joseph Hyksos connection? Lauren, we're having trouble hearing you. Can you check your mic? Lauren? Oh, that's better. Yep. Here's an here's another interesting thing. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Lauren. Hmm. Well, it depends on what they were made of, right? Um, were the silos made of something that was super durable, like the pyramids were? Um, would they have had reason to tear them down and build new ones later in time? But here's an interesting thing. Modern historians are looking at the archaeological evidence and saying, we don't see an invasion. We don't see the evidence of this massive warfare. They just seem to have gradually conquered more and more of the kingdom. And a lot of it seems to have been by treaty and by surrender, because we don't see the evidence of the warfare. We don't see the massive death. We don't see, there's conquest leaves traces, right? Well, here's a thought. What if the reason the Hyksos were able to so quickly take over most of uh, Lower Egypt, most of the northern region, is because of the famine? Remember what happened? There were 7 years of plenty. They stored up all this grain. And then when the famine hit, all the people came to Joseph to buy grain. They didn't have grain. They didn't have money. Then they didn't have livestock. When they ran out of things to trade, they gave themselves, right? What if it was that 7 year period that led to the Hyksos taking over Lower Egypt based on two, no, 2 years into the famine? The good time came first, right? Sure, but their multiplication would have been over the course of the next centuries, the time period between um, Jacob coming into Egypt and Moses leading the people out. Um, and keep in mind, I'm not a big fan of any Egyptian chronology that is out there. So this is going to show my bias, but I think the Israelites were in Egypt for at least 300 years, which is why I think the Hyksos dates that date the reign of the Hyksos, that date the second intermediate period to the 1780s, are probably more accurate than the ones that say it was in the 1700s, or I'm sorry, the 1600s. Um, there are warring chronologies about the timeline of Egyptian history. One of those chronologies, one of the two major chronologies, says the Hyksos were in the 1600s. Another says they were in the 1700s, around 1780-ish. That's when I think the Hyksos were there. That's when I think Joseph was there. So you're actually talking about um, about uh, at least 300 to 330 years um, before you get to, or from the time that the Hyksos reign first started until you get to Moses leading the people out. I think that you can take off part of that for the time that uh, before Joseph got to stand before the Pharaoh, but I think it was at least 300 years. Yeah, they that's what it says in Genesis. It was the second year of the famine when uh, Joseph's brothers came to him in Egypt to buy grain. Oh, was the famine? I see what you're saying. Was that during the time of the Hyksos? Um, well, I will say that cyclical famines, were common enough in that region um, that it's hard to date one, or that it's hard to say which famine it was. But I do think there's evidence in that time period for Joseph. For one thing, we have a burial tomb in the shape of a small period um, near near pharaonic pyramids that appears to have a coffin in it, where the person who is depicted on that coffin appears to have Asiatic features, a yellowish skin rather than a dark skin. And interestingly enough, that sarcophagus is empty. So either the body was stolen or the Israelites took whoever was buried there with them when they went back and laid those bones in the tomb of the patriarchs. Now, secular archaeologists will say there's no proof that that's Joseph, um, and I wouldn't argue with that, but there's no proof that it isn't Joseph either. Yeah, yeah, because Egyptian chronology is a mess, and it has been since the time of Manetho. So 2,400 years after Manetho, we're as confused as they were, but we are finding more evidence the more we dig. So I'm hoping that we actually get more clarity on this as the years go on. Here's what I think. Um, I think the Bible timeline is reliable. I think that we have some reason for discussion around, we can look at the Septuagint chronology versus the Masoretic chronology versus the Samaritan chronology, but you know, those are different biblical lenses, if you will, through which to see the chronology of the Bible. What you don't see is it shifting all over the place and changing all the time. That's what you see with Egyptian chronology, Grecian chronology, Middle Eastern chronology. It's shifting all over the place all the time, right? We dig something up and we're like, oh, we got to revise the chronology. Um, you, good Christian men can have a little bit, and good Jewish men can have a little bit of debate over, is the Septuagint the most accurate one, or is the Masoretic the most accurate one? Fine. But if you're going to say, here's a timeline, let's compare everything else to this timeline, the most consistent timeline we have is the biblical one. So what I do is I look for common events or likely intersection points between biblical history and the ancient histories of the peoples of the world. And I shift their chronologies to fit the Bible chronology. And when it comes to the Exodus, for example, we have a pretty good idea when Josiah was killed in battle around 610 to 608 BC. You can count backward from Josiah in Chronicles and Kings, and you can work your way all the way back to Solomon, and you can say with fair amount of certainty that when God said that it was either 480 years or 440 years, depending on the Septuagint or the Masoretic, after the Israelites came out of Egypt, that he began work on the temple, and it was in the fourth year of his reign. You can go backward from Josiah dying in battle. You can go backward all the way to Solomon, and then you can say the Exodus must have happened around 1405 to 1450 BC. You can be pretty sure it's in that time frame. And Joseph would have lived roughly 300 years before that. So that puts you in the mid to late 1700s, which means that if the Hyksos are the most likely place for Joseph to appear, and it's likely, and it's one of the possible timelines that fits Egyptian chronology, that's when the Hyksos were there. I think that I'm not going to call that definitive, but I'm going to call that pretty good investigative work to say the preponderance of the evidence tells me the Hyksos were the pharaohs of Joseph. Um, and any Egyptologist that wants to argue the point is welcome to come over to my house for coffee. Um, but yeah, one of the things that you mentioned about the multiplication of the Israelites has always been something that boggles my mind. It was one of the reasons I was a diehard 430 years in Egypt guy for so long, because I just couldn't figure out how you get from 70 to 76 people to a couple of million in the wilderness in less than 4 centuries. Even though we know there's supernatural procreation rates, God blessed them and they multiplied. That's a pretty large increase in that period of time. However, I also think it's important to note that we are dealing with supernatural procreation, and just because something strains natural explanation doesn't mean it defies supernatural explanation. Um, when I realized that there was no real credible way um, that I could reconcile 430 years in Egypt with Genesis's clear account about who went into Egypt and who the generations were between Levi and Moses and Aaron, um, the best I could do was 300 to 350 years maximum range. And recognizing that the giving of the promise that Paul probably referred to the giving of the promise to Isaac, that's when I came to, I think Joseph was in Egypt in the mid to late 1700s BC. and the Hyksos had recently come into power. Um, Now, I will also say lots of great Christian historians, biblical historians disagree with me on that timeline. They think Joseph is earlier than that, um, and that's okay. They're welcome to their opinion. I even try to point out where I can the other possible intersection points where Joseph might have been. Some think it was actually during the Middle Kingdom, which we covered last week. Um, I think Abraham belongs in the Middle Kingdom. Um, I think Joseph belongs in the second intermediate period. I think Moses belongs in the New Kingdom era. I don't think any of them belong in the time of Ramesses. That's close. No, no, at the end of the Judges, because if you're in the around 1440 BC in the time of the Exodus, you're about 1140 at the end of the time of the Judges. Or no, about 1100 in the time, the end of the time of the Judges. And then you have the reign of Saul, followed by the reign of David. Right. Yep. And then from the time of Solomon, the divided kingdom, the surviving kingdom of Judah, to the day when Josiah went out and got himself caught up in a war between um, the kings of the east and the kings of Egypt, got himself killed, um, roughly 609 to 607 BC is another 300-ish years, or 300 and almost 400 years. No, I'm sorry, 370-ish years from the end of the reign of Solomon. Um, so no, they hadn't started yet. They were just about to. Yep, from about 607 to about 636 to 637. I mean 536 to 537. Yep. Then you get into what we refer to as the intertestamental period. Right. Yeah, sometimes what happens in the same chapter is not necessarily immediately after. Um, you know, but it is clear from reading Hebrews and from comparing it to what it says in Genesis that Abraham lived with both Isaac and Jacob in tents, and that when Abraham died 100 years after he entered the promised land, um, that his grandsons, Jacob and Esau, were 15 years old. But his death is recorded before their birth. Yep. And I think he actually lived a lot longer. I think most of the chronologies are wrong if you examine the scriptures closely. I think that Abraham's father didn't actually die until shortly before a bride, the bride march was the servant was sent to fetch a bride for Isaac. I actually don't. I think the people who say that Abraham didn't leave um, the land of Syria until his father died, I don't think there's any real evidence for that. I think they're making a mistake. Right, right, right. Before we wrap up today, let me briefly touch on the 16th dynasty. Um, so there's actually three prevailing theories about who the 16th dynasty are. This is the one I think is most likely correct and the most common. The 16th dynasty also was the Hyksos kings in the north, this line of kings ruling a small portion of Egypt in the southern Upper Egypt region from Thebes. So, in other words, eventually the Hyksos also conquered the Theban dynasties, the Theban kingdom, and this was another family line of Hyksos ruling down here. Another theory is that these were native Egyptians, but they were vassals to the Hyksos. Another theory is that this was an entirely independent Theban dynasty of native kings. Okay. But I think it's most likely that the Hyksos, at least for much of their time in Egypt, eventually ruled just about everything before the 17th dynasty came in, as we'll learn about next week, and drove them out. Um, and I think in their wake, when the Hyksos had been driven out slash conquered, that's when the Israelites became enslaved. And they weren't alone, by the way. Um, the 17th dynasty, um, a lot of people were left behind by the Hyksos who were foreigners, and the Israelites were not the only ones who were enslaved. Any questions or comments about the uh, second intermediate period? So I'm going to warn you now, the Middle Kingdom, which is scheduled for one class that was supposed to be today. Then I had to go and get sick last week. Um, may very well take 2 weeks, especially if we look at the timeline and how the story of Moses most likely fits into the Middle Kingdom. So there's a good chance that it'll be Monday and Tuesday, not just Monday, which may mean that we'll be rushing through some history toward the end of the semester or even pushing some lessons into next semester, just to give you kind of a pre-warning that may happen depending on how many rabbit trails I get off on next Monday, especially. Um, if there's nothing further, then I'll let you guys go a few minutes early, and I will see you in chapel. Thank you.